All right, thank you everyone for coming. This is PHP 7. If that's not what you're here for, one of us is in the wrong room, and I hope it's not me. My name is Larry Garfield. You may know me online as Crell. If you want to make fun of me on Twitter during a session, that's where you do so. I highly encourage it. I am Senior Architect with Palantir.net. We're a full-service web agency based here in Chicago, mostly Drupal, but not exclusively, and mostly institutional nonprofits, universities, museums, hospitals, that sort of thing. For Drupal 8, I was the Web Services Initiative Lead. I'm the Drupal representative to the PHP Framework on Interoperability Group. You're all familiar with the FIG, right? It's like United Nations of PHP, with all the good and bad implications that has. The Europeans are laughing more than that one, okay. And I do implement PSR8. It's the huggable interface, as does most of Drupal. So, let's talk about PHP 7. What happened to PHP 6?
Gone.
Pretty much. PHP 6 actually eloped with Perl 6 and left for Mongolia. Neither of which will ever be seen again. No, realistically. PHP 6 almost happened. You'll actually find books from 10 years ago talking about, like 6 years ago, talking about things coming in PHP 6 that was never released because one of its big features was supposed to be Unicode support, which never actually worked. So they ripped that out, threw it away, and took everything else that was going to be PHP 6 and called it PHP 5.3. So we've been living in the PHP 6 era for the last several years without realizing it. So, and then when the new version finally came out, it said, let's avoid confusion, let's go straight to 7. 6 is a cursed number, which actually it is in a lot of open source projects. So, all right. Who's heard about PHP 7? Okay, good. I don't need to tell you what PHP is. PHP 7 was released December of last year. A lot of new features, a lot of functionality, a lot of benefits, changes to our favorite language. I hope favorite language if you're in this room. So why should we use it? What's actually the big deal? Why bother? There's a lot going on with PHP 7. There's more than I can cover in an hour. I'm going to just go through the top 10 things that I think make me excited about PHP 7, and hopefully going to make you excited about PHP 7, so you run out of here and go straight to your servers and upgrade them, because that's my goal for today. So let's get right to that. Number one, let me ask you this question. Do you trust your doc blocks? Who here trusts their doc blocks implicitly? That's what I thought. So we've got this code here, it does stuff. We'll get back to the details. But this getAddress method, what is it returning? What exactly is address? Is that a string? Is it an address object of some kind? What's the structure of that address object? And if I pass this that address object to this compute shipping, is that going to work? Is it even vaguely the right thing? I don't know. Okay, it's an address. It's an address object. Good, I know this now. Do I? Maybe. I'm going to claim it's an address. I'm going to assert it's an address. I can't always prove that it's an address. In fact, even at this point, I could still be returning null, depending on the situation and what code is run before this. And returning null when you expect an object is evil. Please don't do that. What we really want is some way to say, this is going to be an address, I promise you that, and I promise you that my documentation is correct. I promise you that this will work the way I say it's going to. Well, now we can. PHP 7 introduces return types. You can now specify after a function or method the type of variable that will get returned. In this case, we're saying getAddress is going to return an address object. If it does not, you get an error. You get a type error from the system. These are new in PHP 7, and they're not null. What does that mean? It means if I say I'm returning an address object, it means what comes back will be an instance of the address class. It will not be an address class or null. It will be an address. If I try to do something else, the engine itself will yell at me. If I have code that is going to do something else, a static analyzer, like my IDE, can often catch that for me and say, dude, you're doing it wrong. This is going to break. Don't do that. Avoiding nulls avoids errors. Why is this important? Well, Who's written code like this before? Okay, you've got a repository, pull an object out of it, and then just get some other stuff off that. Makes sense? When you run this code, what happens? You get this error, which doesn't tell you anything useful. Which of those objects is not an object? I don't know. How did it get there? I don't know. So how do you fix this? You sign out a whole bunch of if statements to your code, because that's pretty much all you can do, and that sucks. If your returns are typed, then you know what's going to come back from this is the right object type. And if it doesn't, you will get an error from the engine itself telling you exactly what went wrong and exactly where. So you can fix it. And your static analyzer can say, you're doing it wrong here, fix it before you even get to production. You can get to testing. Of course, if it's not null, then what else do you do in an error case? Well, you could throw an exception, or you could define some kind of empty value object. What does that mean? Which you want to use? It kind of depends on the use case. You have to judge this for yourself, which one's appropriate. My recommendation is for things like repositories and services, throw an exception. Here I'm saying this find by ID method on the user repository is going to return a user object. If for some reason I can't return a user object, the odds of the code after this working are pretty remote anyway, so I might as well throw an exception and say, this is just broken, fix it. And then I can handle that as an exceptional error case, which kind of makes sense. For value objects, I recommend having an empty object of some kind. For primitives like int or string, there is a native empty concept. You have an empty string or you have 0. For objects, you're on your own to define one based on whatever business logic makes sense for you. So in this case, we're saying we've got an address interface, and we've got an address that has actual data in it, and we've also got this empty class that's just going to return a bunch of empty strings for each of those methods. Does this make sense? I don't know. Depends on your particular use case. In my use case, this makes sense, and yours, you might want to do it differently. But it becomes your job to define these error handling cases explicitly, rather than saying, I'm going to return something and you can hope that I'm right. Incidentally, never ever return false, unless you're also returning true. If you return false on an error condition, this is just how bad it is. If you have an error condition and you return false, you're telling your consumer of your API, there's a problem, and I refuse to tell you what it is. Blah, 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 blah. Do not do that to your users. That's just rude. Number 2.
How about null?
There are occasionally use cases for null, but they're rare. These other options are better, and you can guarantee to your users, to your consumers, by using a return type, I am not going to give you null. I'm promising you that. Number 2. All right, so we've got this code similar to what we had before. We have this compute shipping function. We've got distance between. Okay, so compute shipping is going to call distance between. And what's the distance between going to return, though? What kind of number? Are we rounding? I don't know. This doesn't tell me anything here. Oh, okay. Distance between is going to return an int. I'm going to round that off. And the compute shipping, I know is going to be decimal, so oh my. Scalar types. PHP 7 now supports scalar types on returns and on parameters. In other words, if you ever see Andrea Falls or Anthony Ferrara at a conference, you owe them both a drink. Probably several. They're the ones who actually managed to push this through. This is the biggest feature in PHP 7. And as of PHP 7, you can now type int, float, string, or bool on returns and on parameters. Note it's int and bool, not integer and boolean. Those keywords don't have any meaning. It's int and bool. Which means you can now type on int, float, string, bool, array, callable, or any class name, one you define or one that's defined in the standard library. This is great. This is fantastic. This is about time. So let's look at this address from before to see why. And look at this GetStreet method. What does that return? Is it going to return a string or an object? Both are valid approaches. You could have a street address that's a string, or you could break it out into a street name, a street number, an apartment number. Both are completely legitimate ways to design a system. Which one are you doing? Well, I don't know. Oh, okay, it's a string. I know this. It's just obvious. I can just look at it, and the code will enforce it for me. And then on the class itself, I specify the parameter types here too. So I get strings in, I get strings out. I know what I've got the entire way through. This is great. Why is this great? Well, let's try to use this code. Let's create a couple of address objects and do stuff with them. Okay. What's wrong with this?
Zip code is a number.
Zip code is a number, yeah. In the United States, zip codes are not numbers. They are numeric strings. There is a difference. Why is there a difference? Because in the Northeast, zip codes begin with 0. What happens if you have a number that begins with 0 in PHP? It's an octal. It's in base 8. Which means that this number in the code becomes the integer 1099. And I will pass that to this function that expects a string. And PHP will dutifully say, an int, yeah, I can turn that into a string, no problem, cool. And you'll end up with a zip code of 1099. And you'll save that to your database. And a month later, you'll load it and try to do something with that. Try to run some computation, and your code will blow up. And you'll have no idea why! This is why. Because ints and strings are not, in fact, the same thing. What do we do about this? This is actually the biggest dispute in PHP 7, in the Scalar type implementation. How do we handle this kind of case? What do we do? Do we have PHP be picky, or lazy and coarse as we're used to doing? The answer is both. PHP, you laugh, this actually was a good compromise given the situation we had. It took me a while to come around to it, but it does make sense. In weak mode, which is default, PHP will cast variables like we're used to. If you pass an integer to something expecting a string, it will say, okay, close enough. Pass an integer to something expecting a float, it'll say, okay, close enough. You pass floating point number 0 to something expecting Boolean, it'll say, okay, 0 is close enough to false. And the same kind of casting logic that we're used to from everywhere else in PHP. The one exception of if something wants a string, something wants an int, and you give it a string that is not completely numeric, it will still truncate it at the first non-numeric character, but it will also throw a notice. So if you try to return the string 123 ABC when it's supposed to return an int, it'll return 123 and throw an e-notice. So you should still fix that. Because this is what happens if you don't. And this is reasonably compatible and works often. And for objects that you're returning, it doesn't really make a difference. But this does undermine type checking. This does not catch the problem we just saw of oops, octal. So instead, you can force your code into strict mode by putting this declare statement at the top of a file. This is a per file toggle. In this case, you're telling PHP, be picky and pedantic about my types. If I define these are strings, then that does nothing, because it calls into this file. Here, however, if I return zip, and zip is not an actual string-typed variable, PHP will yell at me. It'll give me an error. This also means your tooling can spot it. If you have a static analyzer, if you have an IDE, it can catch this kind of stuff for you before you even save your file. But note, this only affects calls from this file, which means calls to the constructor are completely unaffected by being in strict mode. They'll get cast to strings before. So in the constructor here, I will have strings, guaranteed. But they may have been coerced. If in another file, we declare that to strict, now that's going to impact the constructor call here, because the call is from this file. The idea here, and in this case we'll get a type error thrown in both of these cases. The idea here is that people did not want someone else's use of strict mode to force me into strict mode. So only your code in your file is affected by strict mode. If someone else has their file in strict mode, that doesn't affect you at all. You will get the types you want. You can opt per file, strict mode or not. If you're in strict mode, the only pass that happens is an integer is safe to pass to a float, because there's really no way that can go wrong unless you're dealing with obscenely huge numbers on certain CPU architectures, and other languages have the same issue, so ignore I just said that. It's safe. If you need to convert a variable type, you have to explicitly cast it in this case, or really just redesign your code so that you don't have that problem in the first place, which you should do, because if your types have a mismatch, it means your code is wrong in the first place. That's the whole point of types, is to catch those kind of design bugs early. When should you use strict mode? Almost always. It's not the default. I'm here to tell you, you should use this almost always so it can catch the most bugs. The exception is when dealing with input, because we work on the web, which means everything comes into our system as a string. Everything from HTTP starts as a string. Everything out of a database is going to be a string. So when you're doing input, you can leave that in weak mode. And then pass that to somewhere else. It will get coerced as needed, and then stay in strict mode. Incidentally, this also means that you're going to need to put your input into a separate file, a separate class, than anything else in your system, which you should be doing anyway. This drives good design separation. It's also documentation. Who's heard the line, good code is self-documenting? You don't need comments if it's well written. Only one person has heard that line before?
Heard it but don't believe it.
Heard it but don't believe it. Anyone who says that and is not using strict mode is a hypocrite. This is documentation. Typing is a form of documentation that cannot go out of date, because if it goes out of date, you get a parse error. Anyone who says you don't need to document your code, if they are not typing every return statement and every parameter, they're a hypocrite. Call them on it. Make sure that you don't get called on it yourself. Of course, one note, one BC warning, we are a couple of new reserved words here. You can no longer have classes named int, string, float, and bool. There were a couple projects, including Symfony, that had these. They're easy to fix. It's actually really easy to fix with inheritance. So Symfony did that really easily. Drupal fixed that a long time ago. Boy, those are heavy. How about something lighter? Huh? Who's written code like this before? You want to use usort to sort an array or a collection of some kind, and so you give it a custom comparison function, and you need to return -1 if the first one is less, and the first one is greater, you return 1. Otherwise, if they're equal, you return 0. And to be honest, every single time I do this, I have to look up which one is which. I can never remember which one is which. It always confuses me. I can never remember. And this is a lot of boilerplate code I don't want to have to deal with. So we fixed that. Spaceship operator. It's called the spaceship. This is actually the thing of the token in the PHP engine is tspaceship, because the operator kind of looks like a spaceship, specifically a tie interceptor. See, you got the arrow here and arrow here. Took her a moment. So how does this work? Like that. This is exactly the same as that previous slide. Sort A and B normally and return -1, 0, or 1 as appropriate. I'm not actually going to think about which one is which, just that. That's all I need to do. I don't need to remember which one is which. Okay, well that's kind of a contrived example because that's just the default sort. Usually you want to do something more interesting like this. You want to compare two person objects by last name, and sort by last name, and then if the last names are the same, then sort by first name. And this is a lot of code. This is ugly. This is hard to read. Can we make this any shorter? Well, we could use ternaries. No, we can't. Or we could use the spaceship. When you compare two arrays, it does exactly that. First compare by the first key, the first position, and then compare by the second position. This one-liner is the equivalent of that previous slide. And you can put as many elements in here as you want, and it'll just work. You want to sort by middle name next? Okay, just throw a middle name in on each array. Done. That's the spaceship operator. Wow?
We're gonna fly away.
Yes. That's why I'm waving my arms so much. Another nice little feature. We're all familiar with the ternary, which, yes, has valid uses, just not the one we saw before. And this is such a common pattern that you can now abbreviate it in, like PHP 5.4, I think, added this, maybe it was 5.3. Abbreviate it this way. Just say, all right, username, unless it's false, and then use anonymous. They return anonymous. Unfortunately, that assumes that the username variable exists, and in more complex cases, we're actually talking about some kind of array key out of here, which may or may not exist, which means we end up with this fun error. Undefined variable. Good, lovely, whatever. So we end up with ugly code like this. Who's written this before? This is a concept called null coalesce, which you can now write this way. Yay! This is username, anonymous. That is how the operator is correctly pronounced, at least as far as I'm concerned. If username is null, then you get anonymous. If it's not null, you get username. And this also checks for isset. And it is nestable, or chainable. So you can say, if some submit beta has a username key, username, anonymous. And this username variable will get whichever one of these exists first, and is not null. One catch here, though. The operator checks for setness, not truthiness. So if it is set and it has a value of 0 or false or empty array, that will still pass this check. If you want to check for something is defined and not null and is a truthy value, you still have to do your own thing. But this still handles a lot of common cases. All right, let's move on a bit. You're going to like this section. I'm pointing at you.
Oh.
Yes.
Hi.
Because cryptography is hard.
Yes, it is.
Cryptography is very hard. In order to deal with cryptography, you need to work with really, really big random prime numbers. Who is really good at working with really, really big random prime numbers? I'm not. Also, computers aren't actually random. Things have to be kind of random, or mostly random. You need something that's sufficiently random for some definition of sufficient. And we've been doing this in PHP for a while, and don't we already have this solved? I mean, we've got the rand function, which is not actually random. It's really easy to guess. We've got the encrypt routine, that's not really random either. You can read directly from dev urandom that is random, that is sufficiently random, except that it only works on Unix-like operating systems, and on some of them it may be defined differently, like Macs, and on many of them you don't actually have access to that device yourself, so this doesn't actually work half the time. The OpenSSL extension actually has a reliable random routine in it, but I can never figure out the syntax for it. It's god-awful, and it may not be installed. Yeah. We can do better, can't we? As a developer, I don't want to have to think about crypto. What I want is a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator that I can just rely on. This is also known as a C-Spurk. Some people say it's C-Spring, not C-Spurk. There's no I. Okay, let's have one. As of PHP 7, call random bytes with a number of bytes, and you get back that many cryptographically secure random bytes. And you're done. That's all there is to it. No, bytes, not characters. If you try to print this to the screen, you may get weird control characters and do bizarre things to your console. Don't do that. But you will get back 16 cryptographically secure random bytes. Oh, you want to randomize the number between 1 and 100? Okay, you want the random integer between 1 and 100. And that's it. You're done. Don't try to do anything else. In fact, if you're on PHP 5, don't do anything else either. There is a backport Polyfill library. Use it. It's modeled on exactly the same logic is these. If for some reason they cannot generate a cryptographically secure number because there's just not enough support in the system, it will throw an exception. Why? Because if you ask for a cryptographically secure value and you get back something that isn't, guess what? You have a security hole. Let's not do that.
Please.
Please, yes. So if you want, here's the GitHub package for it. It's built by the same people who did the core implementation. And I believe there was an issue to swap this in Drupal in 8.1. I'm not sure if it actually landed. Michael, do you know?
I do not.
No. So at some point, this will get into Drupal as well for the same reason, because someone else solved this, and that's way smarter than we are when it comes to cryptography. So at this point, pretty much, if you're doing anything touching security, and you're not using password hash and password verify for doing your password handling, and you're doing random data for cryptography with anything other than these two, say it with me now. You're fired. Yeah. The tools are there. The tools work. The tools are reliable. They are really easy to use. For the love of God, don't try to do your own security code. And of course, brief BC warning, we do have 2 new functions. If you have global functions defined in your code base with these names, they will now break. So use the ones in PHP instead, because I'm sure they're better than yours. They're certainly better than mine. You know what else is hard? Mocking. Writing tests. This is PHPUnit. I want to mock this repository for my code, and it takes this much code to do that, because I have to call this get mock builder, disable the constructor, and then get the mock. But didn't I just get the mock? Right. And then I have to define this object, and then, oh, I've got another one I have to disable the constructor on and get its mock. And then, it's a second one, and then I have to create this map, syntax in which I do not comprehend, and then return. This is disgusting. It's really powerful. This is disgusting. This is this mock syntax the PHPUnit has used since like 2001 and inherited from Java. Insert your own joke here. Really all we want is a custom class that has this, looks like one of these things, and we can understand what it's doing. But then I have to put the code somewhere, and then I've got extra code I'm writing that I have to manage just for my unit tests. Can't they just define it inline along with the rest of the test, because that's the only place I'm going to use it? Okay. As of PHP 7, you can now declare anonymous classes. This fake repository is going to be an object of some one-off class that extends the class we're mocking. Oh, I want to disable the constructor? Okay, I'll just override it. Oh, I want to change what the load method does? Okay, I'll just write the code that does what I want it to do. I don't need to define it in this custom DSL that nobody understands. I want to do 2 different things and 1 or 2 is passed in? Okay. I can just write the code. I don't need to write it in this abstract layered thing stuff. And then just return it. And I can even nest it if I want to. So this new fake thinky class. Or I can do a real one here. Whatever makes sense in my case. I can just write the code and be done with it. To be honest, I don't actually know of a use case for this functionality other than testing. Supposedly, people have talked about there being other cases. I haven't found one other than testing. But it's really nice here. It means you can just get rid of your mocking libraries, mostly. They can also do one-off dependencies. So like this service I'm testing, I'm going to create, I'm just going to inline in a fake logger for it. It wants a logger. Okay, I'll give it a logger. That is going to just log by printing out a message. That's all it needs to do. And yes, it can take traits. Yes, it can implement an interface. An anonymous class can do pretty much everything a normal class can do, except be serialized. You can't serialize them. Because PHP, whatever. You can implement a constructor as well and pass objects in that way. So new class, it's an anonymous class, it's take a logger. All right, it's going to pass that logger into it, goes into the constructor, and I can do whatever. Just mock the whole thing this way. As with anonymous functions, don't get carried away. You could very easily create completely untestable, incomprehensible spaghetti. Don't do that. But for type one-off cases like testing, this can be really, really easy, really, really simple. There are lots of things that suck in the world, aren't there? You know what else sucks besides mocking and cryptography? Fatal errors. Fatal errors suck. You really have no way to clean up after them. If you've got a finally block, nothing happens. Your destructors don't run. If you need to unwind a database transaction, it may or may not happen. If you try to, PHP has this recoverable error concept, which you can't actually recover from because it just calls your global error handler, which has no context at all for what just happened. Just says, oh, a recoverable error occurred here. I'm lying file, that's all I'm going to tell you. What you're going to do? Well, you can either exit at that point or continue and actually not handle the error. And how is this useful? It's not. In PHP 5, what happens here? So we have this, this function takes a request object, I pass it a user object. What happens? I get an error, catchable fatal error. Okay, this is a global error handler, so I can't actually catch it because I get a white screen or blue screen instead. I can't catch it because there's no actual try catch. This doesn't even make sense. That's okay, PHP 7 fixes this. We can catch it. This is a type error. So type error gets thrown, and we get a type error, which we can catch like any other thrown object and do something useful with it. We have, try to include some buggy code of some kind. We get a parse error. And then we can do whatever makes sense when we have a parse error on code, like including a broken module. We can handle that in some manner that doesn't include the world exploding. Call a non-existent function. We get an error there too that we can catch. We're covered with fatal errors. So, the picture you can sometimes see here, there's now a throwable interface in the engine that has absorbed pretty much everything that was on the exception class before. You can't implement throwable yourself. There's only two kinds of throwable: exceptions, which work like we're used to, and errors. Errors have a couple of subtypes that, just like any other exception subtype, makes sense in a given context. And that means you can catch these independently. Why? Because, well, backward compatibility. We didn't want, the developers of PHP didn't want people who already had a catch exception statement to catch all these other errors now and not know what to do with them. So it's a separate hierarchy now, which does kind of make sense because they are different things. It also means all of these error codes are kind of gone because instead you get these thrown errors. Errors are slightly different than exceptions. Exceptions mean the user screwed up somewhere, case in point. Errors mean the coder screwed up. Only throw an error if the only way that this error could happen is if the code is wrong. An exception is for database connection timed out. Some kind of I/O went wrong. User input was unexpected, whatever. Which means really these are only going to be caught at a high level. You're not going to be catching these at a very low level. You're going to catch these globally. And, oh, there's a parse error. My system's not going to work. But now I can log it. I can clean up. I can show a nice error message rather than just giving a big blue screen as we see, because that's rude, right? It's unlikely that your code's going to continue anyway, or going to be able to continue, but you can now handle it in a much more graceful fashion. Of course, VC warning, there are a couple of new class names that are reserved. And also that global exception handler that you can define, that breaks. In PHP 5, you could do something like this. Set exception handler, and then give it a function of some kind, which means if you have an exception that bubbles up all the way to the top of the system and never gets caught, it'll get caught by this. It's the equivalent of wrapping a try-catch around the entire program. Of course, in PHP 7, you could get errors, not exceptions, so this would give you a type error here. So in 7, you can do it on throwable instead, which catches both. If you want something that works in both 5 and 7, just don't type into it. Sorry. That's all you can do, really, until you got PHP 5 support. Number 8, what's more? Something else that sucks. many things that sucked in the past, huh? Like assertions. Who's used assertions in PHP? Exactly. Because they suck. Why do they suck? Well, the idea, something like this. Got some function, I can just assert that this statement is true. If it's not true, then I report an error and the program just stops. Because they're guaranteed broken at this point. It's useful for more advanced checking than normal types can handle. Like in this case, this array has these keys. If they don't, there is clearly a programmer error. So stop and fix it now. And then ideally you would disable these in production, run them only in development when you're running your tests and stuff, and then in production you disable them so you save all the cost of running that code. Problem. This is a function, which means all of this stuff will get executed no matter what, even in production. So you have to pass it a string to eval. Anytime you say the word eval in PHP, it means you're doing it wrong. So this is why pretty much nobody uses assertions until Drupal 8, actually. In PHP 7, these have been fixed to not suck. PHP 7 introduces something called expectations. Why they're called expectations, I don't know, because they're exactly the same thing as assertions, they just are not broken. So, whatever. But they were called expectations. Basically, they work like they're supposed to. You can turn on assertions, turn them off in production, set assertions to throw exceptions, and then, okay, assert, that's code, and if it fails, throw this error object, which we can then catch and report and so on. Because assert is now a language construct, not a function, which means when you turn off assertions, this entire line just disappears from your production code. It just gets compiled out entirely. Note this is an error, not an exception, because this can only happen for programmer error. Do not use assertions for validating user input. Use it for validating programmer screwed up. This is there to catch your bugs, not the user's bugs. And you still disable it in production to save time. So pretty much, it's assertions don't suck. That's the long story short for this one. Assertions are actually useful now. What else? Here's a fun one that I like talking about. Who likes iterators in PHP? Only a few people. Come on, iterators are cool. Turn an object into something you can for each over, it's neat. Problem. They're very verbose. If you implement an iterator interface yourself, then you have to do all of this boilerplate yourself. And that's annoying and ugly. So let's say I want to get data from a remote data source and from a local database and squeeze them together and treat them all together as the same thing. There's valid use cases for this. And you probably not make it quite this sloppy and with a request, an HTTP request each time, but I'm trying to keep it all on one slide. I couldn't do that otherwise. So I've got all this boilerplate, and then I've just got some kind of database query using PDO. PDO results are also iterable. So now I create an append iterator, and I append two different iterators to it, and then that iterator will iterate over the iterators and iterate each iterator to return a value from each iterator. Still with me?
Yeah. Can you iterate on that?
I'd be happy to iterate on that a couple of times. And then, you for each over that append iterator, and it will unroll it as you go and do each one. That's an awful lot of code. That's annoying. We can do better. In fact, since PHP 5.5, you've been able to do better. You should be using these already. You've got a function get remote values, and I'm just going to grab values from here. Again, should do it smarter. And then yield a value. Yield means return this value as part of an iterator and pause. And when this iterator is next called, it will pick up where it left off. So this code here is equivalent to the entire class we had on the previous slide. Does the same thing. A little bit of code. For get local values, all right. Iterate over our database results and yield each one. You've been able to do this since 5.5. This is a really nice way to handle sets by using iterators in a tiny bit of code. Generators are really cool. What's new in 5.7, in PHP 7, is you can now nest them very easily. Yield from get remote values, yield from get local values. This is exactly the same as the append iterator, it just actually makes sense. And you can read it. And the syntax is borrowed from Python. So if you've ever written Python, it's the same idea. And they can also return a value at the end. So you call this getValues function. That returns an iterator object, which you can then iterate over and do whatever it is you're doing. And then when it's all done, there's still a return value you can look at. To be honest, you're unlikely to ever use the return functionality yourself. Where this is most useful is coroutines, which you can do now in PHP as of 5.5. There's a project called icicle.io that is doing coroutine-based async in PHP. It's really cool. I could do an entire talk on that, so I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. But this is really cool, obscure language features that are going to change the way PHP works in a couple of years. Bear with me on that one. But definitely check out icicle.io. It's a way to do asynchronous code that looks like synchronous code using generators. You just have a lot more yield keywords around. And finally, let me ask you this question. What does this code do? So, someone said, oh no. Yes. Is this the foo variable, the variable names the value of $foo, and then that's an array and then the bar and baz keyword, or is it the foo array and the bar keyword and then the variable of that name? And I have no idea. How about this one? How does this actually work? Which dereferences first? Does this happen first, or does that happen first? Or this? What exactly am I trying to call here? The value of this array? The value of the property food that the market had? Whatever. I'm lost. Oh God. PHP is extremely inconsistent in this regard. When you have variable variables or things that are implicitly variable variables, the parsing logic is just weird. And so this changed in PHP 7 with uniform variable syntax. This was done mainly to make the parser easier, but it ended up making things a lot more logical for user space too. The rule now, it always reads left to right, period. It also adds a couple of new options. So what do these do? Left to right, we've got a foo variable. We're going to call that variable, so it's a callable. It's going to return an array, and we're going to dereference the bar attribute of that, which we're then going to call. Left to right, I know exactly what I should expect it to do. I've got an array of objects. I want the 0th item off it, that's object 1, and I want this property off of it. Okay. I'm going to call this function and get a string back, and then I'm going to just dereference the first character out of that string. I want, this weird case, it's the foo array, it's bar property key, which is going to be a string, which is a class name off of which I'm going to get the $baz, the property names $baz. Some of the syntax was impossible in previous versions of PHP. You have to assign things to intermediary variables along the way. I call a foo, I can call it, and when it comes back to that, I just call that too. With your parameters or without parameters. Everything is nice and simple. You can even do weird things like, I'm going to call something and just dereference an array off of it, or a property, or call a method on the thing that comes back from it, or call it directly, which means I can now do an anonymous function that I call immediately without having to assign it to a variable, just like in JavaScript. I can't believe I just said that. You may not want to do that, but you can. And it's logical. Everything about how you dereference that variable is logical. It also means that, I've got a property on an object that is itself a callable. It's an anonymous function I've saved. Okay, I can just wrap it in parentheses to make sure it gets called in the right order, and then call that thing. I don't need to assign that off to a separate variable first. This is really, really nice. It's really, really straightforward, really easy to document, really easy to teach, really easy to just look at and figure out what's going on. Of course, that does mean there's a VC break. If you have one of those complex cases, then the meaning might change subtly. This is the most likely place that you're going to get tripped up with legacy code base under PHP 7. If you're not sure what it's going to be, or you want it to be consistent between 5 and 7, use parentheses, or in a few cases you need to use curly braces. And then in both versions of the language, that will take precedent, and it'll go in the order that you tell it to. So if you really don't know, you want to make sure it's compatible with both, just throw parentheses around until it does what you want.
And for readability, why would you not just do that by default?
What's that?
For readability, why would you not just use the braces or the parentheses by default?
In PHP 5, it might actually be more readable that way, because then you can rely on the parentheses to know which order things are going to be referenced in. In 7, the order is so blatantly obvious, I'd say it's more readable if you don't need all the extra parentheses. If in a particular case it might make more sense, fine. In a few cases you need it for like this one. You might need it, but for the most part, it's going to be logical. If you've got a complex enough case that it's not clear what you're doing, you probably should change it anyway to be a bit clearer. All right. Of course, this is a very big release, which means that there's not just 10 things. PHP 7 goes to 11. It's fast. PHP 7 is really fast. Then I'm going to do the how fast is it?
How fast is it?
Thank you. It's faster than a cheetah pretending to be a kangaroo. I found this picture, I just had to work it in somewhere. Why? Why is PHP 7 so much faster? Well, the reasons are kind of nerdy. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. Mostly it has to do with the PHP engine is written in C, and a lot of really smart people who know how to optimize C code spend a lot of time optimizing C code. And so there's just lots of changes in the internal data structures of the engine that make it way faster and way more memory efficient. I couldn't tell you all the details of that if I tried. It does mean that the API for PECL extensions, for C extensions, changes dramatically. But for user space code, there's very little, if any, change, just from the speed differences. How much faster is it? Well, last October, Rasmus Lerorf, the founder of PHP, did some benchmarks that he likes to show around. Drupal 8, as of last October, under PHP 5.6, got about 1,400 requests a second, best case. Under PHP 7, almost 2,600 requests a second. That's big. And it's better than the HHVM too. WordPress? Okay, in this case, HHVM is better than PHP 7 by a little bit, but still, both are way better than 5.6. Also, can I just note we said 2,600 on the last slide? 604. Booyah. PHPDB, okay, in this case, yeah, PHP 7 has an edge over HHVM, but both are still way better than 5.6. MediaWiki, in this case, HHVM has a very solid lead over PHP 7, but still, both are way better than 5.6. I've seen a lot of these kind of benchmarks put out by both the PHP team and the HHVM team. When Zen puts out statistics, they always say PHP 7 is faster than HHVM. When Facebook puts out statistics, they always say HHVM is faster than PHP. Bottom line, both of them blow PHP 5 out of the water. Upgrade to something. The number one performance improvement you can make on your server right now is upgrade to PHP 7. The engine itself is twice as fast. That won't help with anything I/O bound. For anything CPU bound, though, that is a huge deal. And Drupal is a very CPU bound system at this point. It is a huge improvement. But I'm sure someone is saying, I'm scared of .0 releases. And you're right. .0 releases of software are often not the greatest. But in this case, it's actually pretty good. These are PHP projects that have already said their latest versions run and run well under PHP 7. Drupal, Symfony, Zen Framework, Laravel, Yi, Magento, Slim, WordPress, Cake, Document, PHPUnit, and probably others I didn't find a logo for very quickly. All of these projects, their latest stable version runs just fine under PHP 7. It is stable, it is trustworthy. In fact, the PHP 7 release was pushed back from late November to early December because of Drupal. Because we were running our test suite on PHP 7 dev for a year. Was it a year? For a long time before release, finding bugs in both Drupal and in PHP. And we were reporting a ton of bugs back to PHP to fix them because Drupal is the regression test for array handling in PHP. Credit goes to James Gilliland for that line. And we actually found a bug in the memory manager at the last minute. And he said, all right, thank you, we fixed that, but let's give it an extra 2 weeks just to make sure we didn't break anything else. They didn't until they released. So it is as battle tested as you can get for software that at a .0 release. So I think 7.05 is in RC1 right now. So it's still steadily improving. Of course, can you actually use it in production? Is anyone offering it? phpversions.info. The community maintains sites keeping track of hosts that are offering PHP, what versions they offer. As of when I last checked, there were 28 hosts listed there that were offering PHP 7. And that number is going up. I'm happy to say that both Platform SH and Pantheon are among them, are offering PHP 7. Acquia is working on it and should soon, they've said. I can't give anything more specific than that, they told me not to. But if you want PHP 7 today, and you want a host that offers it, you've got options. If your current host doesn't offer it, go to another host. There's plenty to choose from. There's a couple of Packer modules that aren't fully ported yet. That's really the only thing holding you back at this point, would be those, and those will get resolved soon enough. Many of them just administrative issues keeping those from launching. And so that, in a nutshell, is PHP 7. It's here, it's ready, it's stable, it's awesome, it's fast. Start using it now. It is the correct way to run Drupal 8. Thank you. Got a couple more minutes if people have questions. Yo.
So I have 2 questions. One, you mentioned static analyzers. Have you had any experience using PHP 7 static analyzers as part of your CI stack?
I have not. Aside from things like PHP Storm already supports much of this. I think the latest release supports all of it, probably. And a couple of other things I didn't talk about. There are pair static analyzers written by Rasmus and by Anthony Ferrara that I've not worked with that are actually PHP-based static analyzers for PHP. Weird as that sounds. And that can do a lot of really good stuff. Things like PHP mess detector are static analyzers. So you should be using that anyway. And that will get support for PHP 7 in due order if it doesn't have it already. So yeah, I don't personally have experience with dedicated ones on PHP 7, but they're getting good fast.
So then the second question is, what do you think the likelihood is that D7 will run PHP 7?
Pretty good. Drupal 7 currently has a few test failures that prevent it from passing the full test suite under 5.4 and above. But if you're running on Acquia, you're already running on 5.5 and soon 5.6. So it runs just fine on those. We've launched, at Palantir, we've launched sites on hosts with 5.5, many of them. And I know there are a couple of open issues fixing the remaining test fails. So I would say within a few months, we should have full test passage for Drupal 7 under PHP 7 as well. So that's coming soon, I'm fairly confident. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of these new things are things existing languages have already implemented and have for a long time. Do you think there's anything missing in PHP 7 that we should work forward to implementing?
Oh, absolutely. There's an RFC being discussed right now that I hope passes, but it's still in early stages, to add explicit typing to object properties. I would love to see that. There was an RFC a couple of years ago that didn't pass. I hope someone brings it back up now that we're on PHP 7 to add dedicated get set methods for each property as an opt-in thing, which lets you have essentially virtual properties. I would love to see that. There's been discussion of in-language annotations. Again, that's been discussed a couple of times. It hasn't gotten into language. I would love to see that now, as long as it's a good implementation. And there's plenty of other things that a language could have. There's discussion of, at some point, possibly having native async primitives, like async await, like HHVM has. And there's plenty still to do, but this is pretty good for the moment. Anyone else?
A little off topic, not 7 so much, but it's noticeable that Drupal seems to benefit a lot less from HHVM than other platforms. Something to do with arrays?
I don't know. Could be. A lot of HHVM's improvements in performance come from a JIT. So it will actually, as the code is running, analyze what you're doing and re-optimize the code based on the experience of running it in memory. Maybe there's something about Drupal that makes that hard to do. I don't know. I haven't really looked into that. PHP 7 does not have a JIT. It's just naturally fast. But there's discussion of adding a JIT to it at some point. Other questions? All right, then I expect to see you all after lunch at Project Management the Musical. This should be a great show. Some more talented colleagues. Enjoy lunch.